Snow fell in a way that erased the world. It did not drift or dance. It descended with a silent, heavy purpose, a shroud determined to bury the jagged peaks of the Rockies and the dark, stoic pines that clung to their slopes. The silence it brought was absolute, a pressure against the eardrums that made a man feel like the last living thing on earth. For Jebediah, this silence was an old companion, the breath of the solitude he had carved for himself in this high, unforgiving place. His cabin was a small, stubborn knot of warmth against the vast, indifferent white, its chimney breathing a thin plume of gray smoke into the perpetually gray sky. He was a large man, built of the same rock and timber as his surroundings, with a breadth of shoulder that strained the seams of his winter pelts, and a tangle of dark hair and beard that fell to his chest, frosted with ice when he worked outside. His hands, scarred and calloused, could soothe a nervous bull or split a cord of wood with equal, patient force. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a creature who understood that wasted energy was a debt paid to the cold, a debt the mountains always collected. This morning he was checking the line of his property, a ritual less about ownership and more about awareness. The snow was already past his knees, a fine powder that hissed against his leather leggings. The world was a study in monochrome, the white of the snow, the black of the tree trunks, the gray of the sky. Then he saw it. A disruption. A stain of impossible color against the snow near the frozen artery of a creek. It was a soft, defiant pink, a color that had no business existing in this world of stone and ice. He approached slowly, his hand resting on the axe handle at his belt, every instinct honed by years of solitude screaming at the wrongness of it. It was a woman. Or a girl, it was hard to tell. She was small, lying half-curled in a drift, her face as pale as the snow she rested on. She was dressed in a thin silk garment of that impossible pink, a dress made for warm rooms and delicate company, not for the teeth of a mountain blizzard. Her black hair was a stark spill against the white, dusted with flakes of snow like scattered jewels. He knelt, his huge frame a sudden mountain over her, and touched his bare fingers to her neck. The skin was brutally cold, but beneath it a faint, stubborn flutter, a pulse, a life refusing to be extinguished. He looked around, his gaze sweeping the silent, snow-choked forest. There were no tracks but his own, and the faint, almost obliterated impressions leading to where she lay. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. A sigh, like the cracking of ancient ice, escaped him. He had not sought this. He had built his life on the principle of non-interference. The world below could burn, and he would only know it by the quality of the smoke on the wind. But to leave her here was a kind of violence he was not capable of. He scooped her up. She was lighter than a sick calf, a fragile weight in his arms. The pink silk was cold and wet against his furs, and as he began the slow, arduous trek back to his cabin, he felt the profound and unwelcome shift in the silence around him. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. He laid her on the cot near the hearth, the one he rarely used, preferring his own bedroll on the floor closer to the embers. The fire, a constant, living heart in the center of the cabin, crackled and spat, casting flickering orange light across her still features. Her face was fine-boned, a delicate sculpture of porcelain and shadow, her eyelids a bruised, translucent blue. The pink dress was torn at the hem and stained with mud and meltwater. It clung to her slender frame, a testament to a journey that had ended here, in his world of rough-hewn logs and animal hides. For a long while he simply stood there, a giant, uncertain guardian in his own home. The space, which had always felt perfectly measured for one, now seemed crowded, the air thick with her unfamiliar presence, He was a man of routines, of simple, predictable patterns that the seasons dictated. This was chaos in a silk dress. He moved with a sudden, clumsy purpose, stripping off his wet outer pelts and hanging them on pegs by the door. He stoked the fire until it roared, a hungry beast devouring the seasoned pine he fed it. The heat began to fill the small room, a tangible wave pushing back the chill that clung to her. He found a spare wool blanket, coarse and smelling of wood smoke and him, and gently covered her, tucking it around her small form. Her clothes were a problem. Leaving her in the wet silk was a death sentence, but the alternative felt like a violation, a trespass he was not sure how to commit. He settled for pulling off her thin, soaked slippers, his large, rough fingers fumbling with the delicate fabric. Her feet were small and frighteningly white, almost blue at the tips. He chafed them between his palms, the friction a desperate, clumsy prayer for warmth, until a faint blush of life returned to the skin. He brewed a thin broth from dried jerky and herbs, the savory scent a sharp contrast to the sterile cold outside. He didn't know if she could swallow, if she was even aware, but it was all he could think to do. He sat on a low stool beside the cot, the bowl cradled in his hands, and watched her breathe. The rise and fall of her chest beneath the heavy wool was shallow, almost imperceptible. Who was she? Where had she come from? These questions were intrusions, complications he had long ago banished from his life. On the mountain, you did not ask questions of the storm or the stone. You simply endured them. She was a storm of a different kind, one that had broken not against his cabin, but inside it. He waited. The fire popped, the logs settled, and outside the snow continued its silent, relentless descent, sealing them in, cocooning them in a shared, uncertain world. The light from the flames danced across the planes of her face, and he saw a small, dried track on her cheek, a path of a tear that had long since frozen. It was a mark of a sorrow so profound it had survived even the numbing cold, and it struck him with a force that felt more real and more dangerous than any blizzard he had ever faced. The night deepened, pressing against the single window of the cabin like a great, dark animal. Jebediah did not sleep. He sat by the fire, sharpening a skinning knife with slow, methodical strokes of a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape, 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 a familiar anchor in the unsettling quiet. Ever so often his gaze would lift from the blade and settle on the cot, on the still form wrapped in wool. Her breathing had evened out, grown a fraction deeper, a small victory against the cold that had nearly claimed her. He had managed to get a few spoonfuls of the warm broth past her lips, a slow, painstaking process. Her head had lolled to the side, her lips parting just enough, a flicker of instinctual survival in an otherwise lifeless body. He had seen the same instinct in newborn calves, a raw, primal will to live that existed below thought. He looked around the cabin, at the familiar objects of his existence, the stacked firewood, the smoked meats hanging from the rafters, the single bookshelf with its handful of worn volumes, the sturdy table and chair he had made himself. It was a life stripped to its essentials, a fortress against need and complication. And now she was here, a piece of a world he had forsaken, a world of silk dresses and unknown sorrows. Her presence was a question mark hanging in the smoky air. By morning the snow had stopped, but the world outside was transformed, buried under a fresh, impossibly thick blanket of white. A pale, watery light filtered through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He moved to the cot. In the new light he could see the bruising on her arms, dark smudges against her pale skin, and a cut on her temple, partially hidden by her hair. These were not the marks of a simple fall. These were the marks of a struggle. A low moan escaped her lips, and her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, almond-shaped, and filled with a terrifying liquid fear. Her gaze darted around the unfamiliar room, taking in the log walls, the animal pelts, his own looming figure, and she flinched, trying to push herself up, a strangled gasp catching in her throat. He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture he used to calm frightened animals. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "You're safe." The words seemed to mean nothing to her. She shrank back against the wall, pulling the coarse blanket tighter around herself, her eyes wide and wild. He saw that she understood his tone, if not his language. He backed away slowly, giving her space, and gestured toward the fire, then to the bowl of broth he had kept warm on the hearth. He mimed eating, a simple, universal language. She watched him, her expression a mixture of terror and confusion. He placed the bowl on the stool beside her cot and retreated to the far side of the cabin, busying himself with mending a strap on his snowshoes, making his movements slow and non-threatening. He could feel her watching him, a tense, silent scrutiny. After a long time, he heard the faint clink of the spoon against the wooden bowl. A week passed in a state of suspended reality. The blizzard had been the first of a series, a relentless assault of wind and snow that locked the mountains down completely. For Jebediah, it was a familiar rhythm, a time for mending gear, for reading, for the quiet contemplation that was the bedrock of his life. But this year the rhythm was broken. It was punctuated by the soft rustle of her movements, the quiet intake of her breath as she slept, the guarded watchfulness in her dark eyes. She still did not speak, not in a language he could understand, though he would sometimes hear her whispering to herself in a soft, melodic tongue when she thought he wasn't listening. Communication was a pantomime of gestures and intent. He would point to the water bucket. She would nod. She would gesture to a rip in his sleeve. He would hand her his sewing kit. Her fear had receded, replaced by a cautious, wary curiosity. She watched everything he did, from the way he banked the fire at night to the precise manner in which he cleaned his rifle. He learned her name was Leanne. She had written it in the frost on the window pane one morning. Two strange, beautiful characters, and then pointed to herself. He had sounded it out, and she had given him the smallest, most fleeting of smiles. It was the first one he had seen, and it felt like the sun breaking through the perpetual gray clouds. In return, he had pointed to himself. Jebediah. His name sounded harsh and clumsy after the soft sound of hers. She tried to repeat it, her tongue struggling with the unfamiliar syllables, and a flicker of warmth, something akin to amusement, passed between them. Her strength returned slowly. At first, she did little more than sit by the fire, her hands mending his worn clothes with stitches so fine and even they seemed to be spun from spider silk. But as the days wore on, she began to move about the cabin, her steps light and silent. She swept the hearth, organized his haphazard stacks of supplies, and brought a sense of order to his bachelor's existence that he hadn't realized was missing. One morning, he was preparing to head out to the attached lean-to that served as his barn, a small, sturdy structure that sheltered his 2 milk cows and their calves from the worst of the weather. She stopped him at the door, pointing to herself and then to the barn. He hesitated. The barn was his domain, the cattle his responsibility. But there was a quiet determination in her gaze that he found difficult to refuse. He nodded, and she followed him out into the biting cold, wrapped in one of his oversized coats. The warmth and animal smell of the barn was a welcome respite. The cows lowed softly at his approach. He set about his chores, forking hay and breaking the ice in their water trough. He expected her to stay back, to observe from the doorway. Instead, she moved past him, her hands, surprisingly steady, reaching out to stroke the muzzle of the nervous new mother. The cow, usually skittish around anyone but him, leaned into her touch, its large brown eyes softening. Leanne began to hum, a low, gentle melody, as she ran her hand along the animal's flank. She moved with a quiet confidence, her presence seeming to soothe the beasts. She picked up a grooming brush and began working on the cow's matted winter coat, her movements rhythmic and sure. Jebediah stopped what he was doing and watched, a strange feeling twisting in his chest. He had lived his life believing that tenderness was a luxury, a weakness the mountains would not tolerate. Yet here it was, in the heart of a blizzard, a small woman in a borrowed coat, humming a foreign tune to his cattle, and it looked like the farthest thing from weakness he had ever seen. It looked like strength. The barn became their shared space, a neutral ground where the silence between them felt less like a void and more like a comfortable quiet. She had a way with the animals, a deep, instinctual calm that settled over them. She learned the rhythms of the small herd, knowing which calf was neediest, which cow was most stubborn. She would talk to them in her own language, her voice a soft murmur that blended with the sound of the wind howling outside the thick wooden walls. Jebediah found himself listening, not to the words, but to the music of her voice, a gentle current in the harsh landscape of his life. One evening, after the chores were done, they sat by the fire, the cabin filled with the companionable warmth of the hearth and the smell of the simple stew he had made. The storm had finally broken, and a sliver of moon was visible through the window, casting a pale, ethereal light on the snow-dusted pines. The world was still, frozen, and beautiful. "My husband," she said, her voice soft but clear. He looked up, startled. It was the first time she had spoken of her past in his language. Her English was hesitant, pieced together from words he had used, and, he suspected, a knowledge she had kept hidden behind her fear. "He was a good man, strong." She stared into the flames, her eyes seeing a past he could not imagine. "We came for the gold mountain. Everyone said there was a mountain of gold." She gave a small, sad smile. "There was only rock and cold." Jebediah remained silent, letting her speak, knowing that the words were a weight she needed to set down. "They promised him work on the railroad," she continued. "But the work was done. The money was gone. They did not want us anymore. They told us to leave. Said the town was for whites." Her hands clenched in her lap, the knuckles white. "We were walking, trying to reach another place, a bigger place. They found us on the road. 3 of them." The story came out in broken pieces, a narrative fractured by trauma. They had wanted the little money her husband carried. He had tried to fight. He had failed. She had run, fled into the woods as the first snowflakes of the great storm began to fall, their shouts and laughter chasing her until she could run no more. When she finished, the silence that fell was heavier than before, filled with the ghosts of her words. He looked at her, at this small, resilient woman who had survived what would have broken so many others. He saw the vulnerability she had kept so carefully hidden beneath her quiet competence. He finally asked the question that had been sitting in his heart since he'd found her, a question born not of curiosity, but of a deep, aching loneliness he recognized in her. "Why did no one come for you?" Her gaze met his, and for the first time he saw not fear, but a profound and bottomless sorrow. "Because," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "there is no one left to come." In that moment, the wall of his own isolation, the one he had so carefully constructed stone by stone over the years, seemed to crumble into dust. He was a man who had chosen to be alone. She was a woman who had had it forced upon her. And in the quiet warmth of the cabin, surrounded by the vast, indifferent wilderness, they were simply 2 people for whom no one was coming. It was not a bond of pity, but of recognition, a shared understanding that resonated deeper than any words. The soft romance he hadn't known he was capable of began not with a touch, but with that shared truth. Life settled into a new pattern, one that included her as surely as it included the rising sun and the winter snows. The unspoken truth of her words hung between them, not as a pall of sadness, but as the foundation of a fragile trust. He was her safety, and she, in a way he was only beginning to understand, was his. She began to smile more, small, genuine smiles that reached her eyes and lit her face with a quiet beauty. She learned his ways, anticipating his needs, having a hot mug of chicory coffee ready when he came in from the cold, his tools cleaned and set back in their proper place. He, in turn, learned the landscape of her moods, the subtle shift in her expression that told him she was thinking of her past, the quiet hum that meant she was content. He found himself talking more than he had in years, telling her about the mountains, the animals, the way the light changed in the spring. He told her stories of his own past, of a family he had left behind long ago, of a world that had become too loud, too crowded. He spoke of his reasons for seeking solitude and realized, as he said the words aloud to her, that they no longer sounded as convincing as they once had. The cabin, once his fortress, was slowly becoming a home. He watched her one afternoon as she sat patching one of his shirts, her head bent in concentration, the firelight catching the blue-black sheen of her hair. The pink silk dress had been carefully washed and mended, but she rarely wore it, preferring the more practical warmth of the spare trousers and shirts he had given her, which she had altered with her impossibly neat stitches to fit her small frame. But the color of that dress had imprinted itself on his mind. He now saw hints of it everywhere, in the pale blush of a winter sunset, in the heart of a flame. He felt a powerful, unfamiliar urge to protect her, not just from the cold or the dangers of the wilderness, but from the memory of the men who had hurt her, from the world that had cast her out. It was a fierce, primal instinct that went beyond mere decency. He realized he was no longer just sheltering a stranger. He was guarding something precious. The softness between them grew. It was in the way he would place an extra log on the fire when he saw her shiver. It was in the way she would save him the best piece of smoked meat from their dinner. It was a language of small kindnesses, a romance written in gestures rather than words. One evening she reached out and touched the back of his hand where it rested on the table. Her fingers were light, warm. He froze, his breath catching in his chest. He turned his hand over and curled his large, calloused fingers around hers. Her hand was so small in his, yet it felt like an anchor. They sat like that for a long time as the fire burned low, not speaking, the simple contact a vow more powerful than any promise. The vast loneliness of the mountains still surrounded them, but for the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt alone within its grasp. The thaw came slowly, then all at once. The iron grip of winter loosened, the snow receding from the south-facing slopes, the sound of dripping water a constant musical percussion from the eaves of the cabin. The creek, once a silent vein of ice, began to murmur and then roar back to life. The world was waking up, and with it the need for supplies became urgent. Jebediah had stretched his stores as far as they would go, but they were running low on salt, flour, and coffee. A trip to Black Creek, the grimy mining town nestled in the valley below, was unavoidable. It was a place he despised, a festering sore of greed and desperation that he visited only when absolutely necessary. The thought of leaving Leanne alone in the cabin, even for a day, was unthinkable. The memory of her bruises was a constant, ugly reminder of the dangers the world held for her. But the thought of taking her with him was almost as bad. He knew the looks they would get, the leering speculation, the casual cruelty of men who saw her as nothing more than an object, a curiosity. "I have to go to town," he told her one morning, his voice grim. She looked up from the bread she was kneading, her hands dusted with the last of their flour. "We need supplies." She simply nodded, her expression calm, but he saw the flicker of apprehension in her eyes. "You'll stay here," he said, the words more of a command than a suggestion. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I go with you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "No," he said, more sharply than he intended. "It's not safe for you." "Not safe here alone," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "Those men, maybe they come look." She was right. The thaw that allowed him to travel to town also allowed others to travel from it. The men who had attacked her and her husband might be anywhere. The idea of them finding her here, alone and undefended, sent a spike of cold fear through him. He wrestled with the decision, weighing one danger against another. Finally, he let out a long, frustrated breath. "All right," he conceded, "but you stay close. You don't talk to anyone. Understand?" She nodded, a flicker of relief on her face. The journey down the mountain was arduous, the melting snow turning the trails to treacherous mud. When they finally reached the outskirts of Black Creek, the noise and smell of it assaulted him. The town was a chaotic sprawl of ramshackle buildings, saloons spilling drunken laughter into the muddy street, and the ever-present grime of coal dust coating everything. He tethered his horse and led her towards the general store, acutely aware of the heads that turned to watch them pass. Men stopped talking to stare, their eyes lingering on Leanne with a mixture of surprise and crude assessment. He put a hand on the small of her back, a protective, proprietary gesture, and steered her through the gawking crowd. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of leather, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. The storekeeper, a weasel-faced man named Abernathy, looked them over with undisguised curiosity. As Jebediah gave his list of supplies, 3 men entered, their boots loud on the wooden floor. They were rough men, railroad hands by the look of them, and their eyes immediately found Leanne. One of them, a burly man with a greasy beard, nudged his friend. "Well, look what the big man dragged down from his mountain," he sneered, his voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Didn't know they was giving away little china dolls for free." Jebediah's entire body went rigid. He turned slowly, his sheer size seeming to diminish the light in the room. "You have something to say?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The man faltered for a second under the intensity of Jebediah's glare, but his friend snickered, emboldening him. "Just admiring the merchandise," he said with a smirk. "Wonder what she cost you." Before Jebediah could move, Leanne stepped forward slightly. "I cost him nothing," she said, her voice clear and cold, her English perfect. "And I am worth more than you will ever have." The man's smirk vanished, replaced by a flush of angry red. He took a menacing step forward, but stopped dead as Jebediah moved to place himself directly in front of Leanne, a silent, immovable wall of muscle and fury. The air crackled with tension. Abernathy nervously cleared his throat. "Now, boys, let's have no trouble." Jebediah didn't take his eyes off the man. "Get out," he said, each word dropping like a stone. The man and his friends hesitated, weighing the odds. Then, with a final resentful glare, they turned and stomped out of the store. The silence they left behind was thick and heavy. Jebediah gathered his supplies, paid Abernathy without another word, and led Leanne back out into the hostile street, his protective instinct now a raging fire in his gut. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was not over. They rode out of Black Creek under the weight of hostile stares, the silence between them taut as a bowstring. Jebediah pushed his horse hard, wanting to put as much distance as possible between them and the festering town before nightfall. He kept glancing back, his eyes scanning the trail behind them, his hand never far from the rifle in its scabbard. He could feel the men's eyes on them still, a palpable, malevolent presence that followed them up the muddy track into the foothills. Leanne was silent, her back straight, her face a mask of composure, but he could feel the tension radiating from her. He had brought the ugliness of the world to her, the very thing he had sought to shield her from. As the light began to fade, casting long, distorted shadows across the path, he saw them. 3 figures on horseback, keeping their distance but steadily gaining. His heart hammered against his ribs. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice low and urgent. He urged his horse off the main trail, pushing into the dense timber, the branches of pine and fir whipping at them. It was rougher terrain, but it offered cover. The sounds of their pursuers grew louder, crashing through the undergrowth, their voices carrying on the still evening air, coarse and ugly. He found a defensible position, a small clearing backed by a sheer rock face, offering only one direction of approach. He dismounted in one fluid motion, pulling his rifle free. "Stay behind the rock," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. He helped her down, and she scrambled for cover without a word, her movements swift and certain. He watched her go, a fierce pride mixing with his fear. She was no fragile doll. She was a survivor. He turned to face the woods, levering around into the chamber of his rifle. The sound was deafening in the quiet forest. "That's far enough," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the trees. The sounds of pursuit stopped. A tense silence descended. "We just want to talk to the girl," a voice called out, the same sneering tone from the store. "She's got no business with you," Jebediah yelled back, his eyes scanning the deepening shadows for any sign of movement. "We think she does. She was with that railroad chink we had some trouble with a few months back. We got a score to settle." Jebediah's blood ran cold. These were the men, the ones who had left her for dead. The confrontation was no longer about a perceived insult. It was about tying up a loose end. They couldn't afford a witness. He saw a flicker of movement to his left and fired, the shot splintering the bark of a tree inches from where a man had been hiding. A curse rang out. "You're a dead man, mountain man," another voice shouted. He didn't answer. He stayed low, using the trunk of a massive pine for cover, his senses on fire. This was his world. He knew its sounds, its shadows, its rhythms. They were clumsy and loud, used to intimidating with numbers, not to the patient, deadly dance of a forest fight. He saw Leanne peering from behind the rock, her face pale in the gloom. In her hand she held a heavy, thick branch wielded like a club. Her eyes met his across the clearing, and in them he saw not terror, but a fierce, shared resolve. They were in this together. A shot rang out from the woods, the bullet thudding into the tree beside his head. He dropped to one knee, aimed carefully at the muzzle flash, and squeezed the trigger. A cry of pain echoed through the forest, followed by a string of curses. The fight was on. The standoff stretched into the twilight, a terrifying exchange of threats and sporadic gunfire. Jebediah never exposed himself, moving between the trees with a hunter's patience, making his single rifle seem like more. He wounded another of the men, a shot to the leg that elicited a howl of agony and fury. They were not woodsmen. Their frustration grew with every minute that passed, their initial bravado dissolving into angry, panicked shouts. They had expected an easy confrontation, a lone man they could overwhelm. They had not counted on a man who was more at home in the dark and the trees than they were in a saloon. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he heard them retreating, their horses crashing through the undergrowth, their voices laced with pain and threats of return. "This ain't over, you hear me? We'll be back." The sounds faded, leaving behind an ringing silence, thick with the smell of gunpowder and pine. Jebediah remained in place for a long time, his rifle ready, listening until he was certain they were truly gone. Only then did he allow himself to breathe, the tension draining out of him in a long, shuddering exhalation. He turned and walked back to the rock face. Leanne was still there, the heavy branch held tight in her hands, her knuckles white. She looked up at him as he approached, her eyes wide in the gloom. She dropped the branch, and in 2 quick steps she was in his arms, her face buried against his chest, her body trembling with the aftermath of fear. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, his hands stroking her hair. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his own. He was overwhelmed by a wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. Relief, fury, and a deep, profound tenderness. He had faced down bears and blizzards with less fear than he had felt tonight, because tonight he had not just been fighting for his own life. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick. "It's over. You're safe." She pulled back slightly, her hands coming up to frame his face, her thumbs tracing the hard lines of his jaw. Her eyes searched his, filled with an emotion that mirrored his own. The last of the light was gone, and the moon was rising, casting a silver glow over the clearing. The harsh reality of what had just happened, of the violence and the hate, seemed to fade, replaced by the simple, undeniable truth of their survival, of their connection. The distance between them, the last vestiges of their separate lives, dissolved in that shared gaze. He lowered his head, and she rose on her toes to meet him. Their kiss was not gentle. It was desperate and fierce, a collision of relief and newfound possession, a confirmation of life in the face of death. It was the taste of gunpowder and pine, of fear, and of a future he had never dared to imagine. When they finally broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, their breath mingling in the cold night air. The world outside the small clearing ceased to exist. There was only the rock at their backs and the solid, reassuring presence of each other. In the ashes of the confrontation, something new and unbreakable had been forged. They were no longer a man and a woman who had found each other by chance. They were his, and he was hers, bound by the fire they had just walked through together. They made their way back to the cabin under the cold, watchful light of the moon. The journey was slow, a silent procession through the silvered landscape. He walked, leading the horse upon which she sat, his hand resting on her knee, a constant, grounding touch. The cabin, when they reached it, was no longer just a shelter. It was a sanctuary, a haven sealed against the darkness they had left behind them in the woods. Inside, he bolted the heavy wooden door and built up the fire until it blazed, chasing the shadows from every corner. The familiar warmth enveloped them, a comforting blanket against the chill of the night and the deeper chill of their ordeal. They moved around each other in a quiet, synchronized dance, tending to their needs without words. She heated water and brought him a basin and a cloth to wash the grime and tension from his face and hands. He unpacked the supplies, his movements methodical and sure, restoring the familiar order to their small world. When everything was done, they stood on opposite sides of the hearth, the roaring fire between them. The unspoken emotions of the night, the terror, the relief, the fierce, possessive kiss in the forest, all hung in the air. "Jebediah," she said, her voice soft, breaking the silence. He looked at her. She had taken off the heavy coat, and in the firelight, in his worn shirt and trousers, she had never looked more beautiful or more courageous. "They will come back," she said. It was not a question. "I know," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Then we must leave," she stated, though her eyes were filled with a deep sadness at the thought. "This place, it is not safe for you now, because of me." He shook his head slowly, a definitive, resolute movement. He walked around the fire, closing the distance between them until he was standing right in front of her. He reached out and cupped her face in his large, warm hands. "This is my home," he said, his gaze intense, unwavering. "I am not leaving." He paused, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "And you are not the reason it's unsafe. You are the reason it's worth defending." Her eyes filled with tears, a glistening sheen in the firelight. The vulnerability she held so tightly in check was finally allowed to surface, not as a weakness, but as a testament to all she had endured. He saw it all in that moment, the loss, the fear, the incredible resilient strength that had carried her through it all and brought her here, to him. "Lynn," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "stay here with me." It was not a question of shelter anymore. It was not an offer of protection. It was a plea, a raw and honest admission that his solitude was no longer enough, that the silence of his life had been a poor substitute for the music of her presence. It was the one question that mattered more than any other. She leaned into his touch, a silent, profound surrender. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, and he gently wiped it away with his thumb. "Yes," she whispered, the word a promise, a commitment, an anchor. He lowered his head and kissed her again, and this time there was no desperation, no fear. It was a kiss of infinite tenderness and profound gratitude, a slow, deep claiming of a future that had, until this moment, been unimaginable for them both. The fire crackled, the logs settled, and outside the spring night held its breath. The mountains that had been his refuge from the world had become the fortress for theirs, and the cabin, once a symbol of his isolation, was finally, truly, a home.